Hi, thank you guys. Thank you very much, David, for bringing me here. My name is Kanan Linder. Today, as David said, I'll be speaking about gaming on the blockchain. Quick show of hands, who knows what a smart contract is? Okay, how about a token standard? No? Okay, that's perfect then. So what I'll be talking about, just taking a look at the agenda, the first thing, and I'll kind of preface this with what smart contracts are token standards. And this is kind of the language that you'll hear people talking about when they speak on blockchain gaming. What is a NFT or non-fungible token? What is a fungible token or an ERC20 standard? And we'll dive into that. We'll follow that up with some of the blockchain benefits, both from a gaming and publisher perspective. What a lot of people forget, and what my company does today, is you can't, with a platform, only benefit half of the apple. Right? You really have to focus on the whole, because otherwise one side's going to be marginalized and your platform is never going to achieve adoption. So we'll be looking at both sides, both from a gaming and publisher perspective, how blockchain really changes the playing field. After 1 and 2, we're going to get into kind of a gaming Q&A where we can talk about what I've spoken on thus far, and then we'll dive into a little more of the blockchain issues surrounding why blockchain today can't really be utilized as well as we'd like it to be in the gaming sector, and then potential solutions on how we can kind of supercharge the current Ethereum, Bitcoin, and other blockchains to get to where they need to be to have AAA games, which are kind of billion-dollar games running on top of them. A little bit more about myself. I preface this with saying, no, I'm not just a good-looking guy. So I grew up in Palo Alto, California, had enough of Silicon Valley, needed to get out of my parents and far away as possible. So I went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, graduated in 2017, and after that went to work at Bloomberg as a software engineer in Manhattan, New York City. It was at Bloomberg that I really discovered my love of blockchain. I started, the internal blockchain chat room, which quickly grew to over 1,000 people, and really started transitioning from wanting to be an engineer to wanting to be a teacher, and spreading the love of blockchain technology and really how I thought it could benefit quite a few different sectors. So about 8 months in, and this was after the cryptocurrency bubble burst, and I was down and out, having lost all my Bitcoin gains, I said to myself, I really want to do something where I'm in control. I can really take what I love, blockchain, and go sell it and improve people's businesses because of it. And I come from an entrepreneurial family from Silicon Valley, so about 8 months ago, right, early 2018, I left Bloomberg to start my company Stardust, and we're a blockchain SaaS for game publishers. I won't speak much on that during this presentation. This is more informational, but during the Q&A, feel free to ask, and I can go into exactly what my company does and everything I've learned. So before we actually get to this slide, I'll speak a little bit about smart contracts because they kind of preface what token standards are. And for the sake of this conversation, we'll be using the Ethereum blockchain, but most blockchains have a smart contract type framework set up. And what smart contracts are is it allows us to deploy code to the blockchain. And this code can define exactly what we want to trade. So for example, as we see here in ERC20, which is just a simple currency, right? This currency has a name. And we would deploy a smart contract piece of code that says, for this object we are trading, we need to define a name and a valuation for the currency, possibly, or even a circulating supply for it. And so what token standards are is it's a defined set of functions that allow us to talk about these standards as if they were smart contracts. And so, for example, an ERC20 defines a fungible currency. So every fungible currency needs a name, right? It needs a value, and it needs a circulating supply. And so when you hear an ERC20, that's what that is saying, right? It means it has these 3 properties. And what fungibility means, if you don't know, is basically defining, it's a concept of currency where one currency equals another one of the same currency. And so this may be pretty obvious. 1 ether equals 1 ether, $1 equals $1. But as we get into these different standards, you'll see how that's not always the case. And so ERC-20, also known as the shitcoin standard, is what you will hear when you hear things like utility tokens, or most security tokens use an ERC-20 standard. Now an ERC-721 standard revolves, and it was the first foray into kind of the gaming industry of the Ethereum blockchain. And it revolved, and it started with a very popular game called CryptoKitties, the author of which actually authored the ERC-721 standard. And it defines, basically extends the set of functions that we define this currency to have. So instead of just having a name, right, instead of just having a supply, what it has is it has perhaps characteristics, right, like it's a cat, right, or it has, a weapon, it's a sword, right, it has an attack level. And so when you see ERC-721, it is just another set of functions defined as a smart contract that allow us to have a set standard for what this item is. Now, it allows items to be unique, right? It allows us to give them properties. And the concept behind this standard is the circulating supply of each of these items is only one, right? And so every one of these items is unique. And that's where you hear non-fungible token come in, or NFT. That's what that means, is it's an ERC-721 standard, which means it's the only one in existence. So if I create an ERC-721 as a cat, right, and then I create another cat that's another ERC-721, right, they both have different properties. And so they may be the same archetype of cat, right, but they're not fungible as a currency would be. One of these cats is not equal to one of these cats, right? And so this was a big difference from the ERC-20 where everything was alike, right? In the ERC-721, we see everything is different. But if we take a look at the gaming industry today, right, and I have my Pokemon up there, we don't have uniques in many games. Some games we do. And items are not always fungible, meaning all the characters in the game are not of the same type. What we have is some blended combination where, in Pokemon, for example, we have a Pikachu, right? We have a Charizard, we have a Charmander, we have a, Squirtle, Lickitung, feel free to shout them out. So while the archetypes are different, right, and they have non-fungible properties because a Charizard is not equal a Pikachu, not in my book anyway, there's also a fungibility aspect because there are a lot of different Charizards, right? And one Charizard is equal one Charizard, right? But is not equal one Pikachu. And so it's a combination of ERC-721 and ERC-20, where within that one type we have fungibility, but across different types we do not, right? And that's really what ERC-1155 defined is it's a combination where it's a 721 type, where the types of Pokemon are unique, right? Charizard versus Pikachu. But within that subset of Pikachus, they're all fungible. And so that's what 1155 was or is, and you'll see these used kind of interchangeably in gaming articles. Some say 721 when they mean 1155, but these are kind of the three you need to know, when speaking knowledgeably about the space. So as promised, we're going to start with the benefits of blockchain for gamers. And so you hear a lot about ownership of assets. And it comes a little bit more than being able to store all your money under your mattress, which I did during the height. It's a little more on the fact that players now have the ability to choose, right, where they store their asset. Because when banks, store our money, we have the ability to go withdraw it, right? For better or worse, you don't want to carry a briefcase full of $10,000, but there are instances in which you may want to take your most valuable CSGO skins, right, and put them in a secure location, especially in the age of where all our information is online, accounts are recoverable. I personally know myself sellers and traders of CSGO skins who've had their Steam accounts hacked for hundreds of thousands of dollars in worth of skins, right? The ability to safeguard your assets is actually a very large one. And so following up on that, the concept of a ledger. Who knows what the blockchain ledger is? Anyone? Raise your hand. Okay, so when you have a currency, right, on the blockchain, it's all transparent, which means nothing is behind a veil. I can go see who owns every unit of that currency. I can go see how many of that currency are in existence. Right? If the CEO address, blockchain address is dumping the currency on the open market, I can tell. Right? And the same applies for assets and game assets, right? Is where I tell the story about when I was young, I opened a pack of Pokemon cards and I saw the rare card, right? But the rare card was the shiny card. And that's actually a very centralized concept. Seeing a shiny card, that's the publisher telling you this card is rarer than the others in the pack. Right? In fact, that may not be true. It may be the most common card in the pack. There may be the most of those in existence, right? And so what this gives us the ability to do with the open ledger is to see how many of this item actually exist, right? Currently, whether more can be created in future, right? Or is the 10 that are created as of now capped for forever, right? And for collectors and players, this means a lot. You see $1 million baseball cards traded, and then you go in the great-grandfather's attic and they open a chest and they find another one. Right? The circulating supply has gone from 1 to 2, right? That card value's dropped in half because of this mystique. How many really exist? Now we can know, and now we can tell, right? With the openness of a blockchain ledger. Provenance is an interesting concept and something that's a little more farther along in the art industry, but who here has ever gotten a signed baseball card? Ever went to a game, caught a foul ball, gotten it signed? Anybody? Okay, I see a couple in the back. Well, we've never had that concept done with digital assets, right? Because every asset from now, till the end of time, if it doesn't live on the blockchain, we don't really have a decentralized sense of where it's been before, what's happened to it. Has it killed a monster? Has it been signed by a famous streamer? Who used it before me, right? But with blockchain and everything being open, we can now tell those things. And we can get, your favorite item in your game signed by your favorite player, right? Because this is some of the capability that is doable on the ledger and in smart contracts. And I'm going over to figure out what the last one is here, cross-game items. So I'll tell this another story. I love stories. Kitty car racing. So there was a very famous game called CryptoKitties that came out on the Ethereum platform. Had its peak, and then, as with cryptocurrency, it had its downfall, right? Everyone had collected these cats, everyone had these cats, and the game was over. No one wanted to play it anymore. But everyone still had the cat. And so what a developer came along and did is say, hey, all these items on the blockchain have the same standard, right? These same token standards, they have these same functions. I can use that to allow people to use CryptoKitties in my game. So what he did is he created a game called Kitty Car Racing, where you could take your CryptoKitty and pair it with one of his cars and drive it around a little track. And I liken this to actually something in the software engineering industry, where in the early 2000s, open source code was like taboo. Why would I ever open source my code, right? And then people actually discovered by open sourcing their code and selling services off of it and allowing, others to bug fix it and implement it in their software, they actually made more money doing so. And this is actually kind of a paradigm shift where I think we're going to see almost the concept of open border assets, right? Where assets can be used cross-game because they actually bring more value to the ecosystem, being interchangeable within the games. So another story, because I said I love stories. When I was in high school, I went to a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament. And at the Yu-Gi-Oh tournament, I needed one specific card for my deck. It was an Insector deck, if anyone plays Yu-Gi-Oh here. And this one card, I went up to the booth, and it cost $80. And I think my bank account at that time in high school was about $83. So I was in a pickle, really needed this card, ended up splurging, spent $80 on this one card. I was only going to use it for this one tournament, right? And then lost the tournament and went home. And I thought to myself, that sucks. I obviously can't afford this game, so I quit the game, right? But with ubiquitous game logic being on the blockchain for all these items, what it allows us to do is have this concept of a rentable asset, right? And we're going to look at a collectible card as an example. So this is a card called Hyperion. It's part of the game Gods Unchained. It sold for 146 Ether, which was about $250,000 at the time. And it really highlighted this disparity between collectors of cards who can spend $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on a card and people who want to play with that card, right? But with blockchain, what that allows you to do is define logic that says, hey, instead of buying the card outright, right, or instead of buying the armor in World of Warcraft for your next raid, right, I can buy an hour with that item, right? I can buy a day with that item. I can buy a week with that item. Now, for collectors, this really changes the game because right now, collecting is a very capital-intensive strategy over a long period of time, right? And they're relying on the game being more valuable over time and that asset not having a reprint, right? As we've seen in some games, and we've seen the risks with Beanie Babies, for example, with the game crashing out from under everybody, right? And what this allows collectors to do is generate immediate ROI off the item they spent $250,000 on, right? For the player, it gives them access to cards that they never would have had before, right? Because they can buy them, $1,000 for, 6 weeks, or, $10 for 12 hours. While I'm sleeping, my asset's generating me money, right? Really, it's not too much of a stretch, but really like what our options are in the stock market, where, you can buy someone's stock at a premium but not exercise the option, but have all the upside from owning it. It's probably a complicated analogy, so I don't talk more about that. The benefit of blockchain for publishers, right? So we talked about gamers, and now we're going to talk about publishers, which is the other side of the apple, right? And if I say right one more time, someone say wrong, please. So you see some of the ones I listed on the blockchain for gamers slide is the same as on the publisher slide. And that's because aligning incentives, especially in business, is very important, right? Wrong. So provable rarity for a game is very important. When you take a look at games like Magic, right? Even games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, some of the rarest and most valuable cards have held their value over time. And that's actually kept the game afloat among collectors because they see it as a store of value and a profitable store of value. And so it attracts a lot of not only collectors but players to the game, keeps your game up and in the market. Cross-game items. So we talked about this from the player side. From the publisher side, it's very interesting. And going back to the example I used about kitty car racing. So I had my cat, right? I put it in a car, and I'm driving it around in this new game. This is fun, right? But I wanted a better cat for my car, right? And so I thought to myself, I'm not going to go to the car game creators to buy a cat, right? Where am I going to go to buy a new CryptoKitty? Oh, I'm going to go back to the original publisher, right, who made CryptoKitties, right, who licensed their asset out to this other game to use, right? Because now, while CryptoKitties is a dead game, right, the assets within that game and the ROI off those assets are actually outliving the game itself. And this is also a very foreign concept. Once a game dies, all the assets usually die along with it, and so does the publisher. But I think we're going to see that change, where you're going to have publishers who create great assets that are used within this ecosystem, and while the original game may die, the assets actually keep the publisher living and afloat. Founder item sales, maybe not the biggest problem from a billion-dollar game studio's perspective, but from Kickstarter, when you buy into a game, right, you buy into, 6 months from now, I'm going to get my rewards. And what the blockchain allows us to do is it actually allows us to mint these items, right, before the game actually has functionality. You saw that in a lot of ICOs, for better or worse, right? There were tokens before there were actually any products. And, going to Gods Unchained, they raised $3 million for their game before the game was even launched. It's still in development. But they raised $3 million in Ethereum, which is what now, probably worth 500K. I don't know. But, back then, that was a lot. And it really takes us from Kickstarter, where a lot of the disincentive to giving to a campaign is because the rewards aren't tangible or because there is no immediate incentive. We like instant gratification. With blockchain, that can change, where you can give someone the item they paid for, right, even before the game exists. So speaking a little bit more about this in general in the ecosystem, how it contributes to fraud. And I guess I didn't even talk about the gaming numbers in general, so I'll just interject them here. The gaming industry is a $140 billion industry. CAGR is about 12%, with mobile proportionally being a CAGR of 28%. Pretty massive. 80+% of this industry is actually, the revenue is generated from the sale of in-game items, which, as we see, blockchain has a lot of benefits for. And speaking about fraud, 1 in every 7.5 game items is lost to fraud, whether it's a credit card chargeback, whether it's a lost or stolen credit card, whether someone's, just doesn't pay their credit card, and, the end seller doesn't get paid because of that. And so what the blockchain has the ability to do, specifically with stablecoins, is when people onboard fiat to the blockchain, it becomes this, quote-unquote, uncharged backable medium of exchange. And as fiat gateways such as Coinbase with USDC or Tether maybe become more popular, we're going to see ecosystems built around not only blockchain items, but with blockchain fiat or cash as well, to become a completely secure system, lowering that 1 per 7.5 items probably to 1 in 20 or 1 in 30. Last point I have here is secondary asset marketplaces, and this is something pretty game-changing. When you have open information, like a blockchain ledger, it increases competition. And when you see that, you see incentives start to gain and prices start to fall of fees. So, for example, and I'll hop to this next slide, take a look at Steam, right? The Steam community marketplace. And to, I guess, clarify something, a secondary marketplace means player-to-player trades. So this would be, I have a CryptoKitty, I wanted to sell it to Jill for $100, right? On the Steam community marketplace, and a lot of other centralized marketplaces, the setup is quite simple, right? I sell an item for $100, eBay, Amazon. I get 85. The buyer gets the item, and the publisher, the creator of that asset, gets nothing. Okay. Now, with blockchain and the openness of the ledger, we're seeing a lot higher competition so far as decentralized marketplaces, and we're seeing that paradigm start to change. And so, to take an OpenSea example, which, with ironically the Stardust marketplace pricing, the paradigm is changing so that if I sold that CryptoKitty to Jill for $100, right, I would get $90, so the overall fee is decreased, and the marketplace, instead of gaining that full $10, they would actually give half of that, or 5% of the initial sale price, back to the creator of CryptoKitties. And this is a huge change in paradigm from games that have only in the past monetized through microtransactions, can now start to monetize through healthy secondary markets. In games such as RuneScape, right? I was playing that the other day. The initial market in RuneScape is about $200 million a year, pretty big, more than I was expecting. The secondary market of RuneScape is about $2 billion per year. Now 5% off a 10x multiple, that's an extra $100 million the creators of RuneScape could be netting solely through a 5% rev share of a secondary market. That's pretty big. That's an increase of 50% to their bottom line. Pretty large. That's good enough for me to move my game. I hope it is for you as well. So now, as I promised, this is the end of kind of my gaming part of my presentation. There's a little more blockchain inclusive part coming up, but I wanted to open the floor to any questions people had. Give myself a break from talking, at least for a couple seconds. Are there any questions I can answer? Go ahead. Uh-oh. That's good. I need to kill time, so please.
When you were talking about the different codecs for Ethereum 721, 1155, one was fungible. So you said that one was a unique monster, the middle one, at 721, is that right?
729, correct.
Okay, so CryptoKitty would be the example of that. It's a unique monster.
Mm-hmm.
One CryptoKitty may be worth $10, one not worth $0, right?
Yep.
And then the third layer, 1155, is that correct?
Yep.
Can I speak operated terms to you?
Please go.
Okay, so like your big thing's off inheritance. If something has the same off inheritance, the staff is going to have a face value in the market.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Yep, sure.
Can you inherit from multiple options that combine assets within the beautiful thing?
So if I understand you correctly, you can. Do you mean so far as one item could have two archetypes, for example?
And then you can then assign values to two and say this 40% of the value comes from archetype 1, 60% from archetype 2, and now you still have a fungible asset.
Sure. So to open that up to, I guess, everybody else, that'd be like a, I guess electric and water don't go together. That'd be like an electric and grass Pokemon, right? It's got some properties of the electric type and some properties of the grass type. The answer is yes. Assigning, rigid values to each archetype may get you into trouble depending on which one it is. But you could. I mean, of course, it's all, in a sense, this is all code, right? So on the back end, we talk about very rigid item standards, but on the other hand, you can price in whatever function you want. If you wanted to add a pricing function to the 1155, right, and said it had, this archetype and this archetype, you could actually define that per asset, right? And so with these types are actually very malleable in what they allow you to do. So, yes, no problem. Please go ahead. So do you mean, the question was about oversaturation with the 1155 standard. Do you mean so far is, if the item isn't capped in supply, it can just keep growing and growing and growing, or? Mm-hmm. So the quote, combining items or like attaching two items to create a third, maybe of two types, or even spawning your own combination of the two types. That would all be done on a publisher level and a publisher, I guess, case-by-case basis. So they could define simply, we don't want items to be combined, or we do, or perhaps we do, but only for this monster, only 10 of them, right? So the first 10. No. And the reason for that, which I'll get into the next couple slides, is the blockchains aren't even ready for what we have. So before we really get into some of the complex things we can do, we really have to buff up our technology. I guess to kind of preface that, to talk a little bit about that in the Stardust world, which is my company and where I come from. We do tend to promote out-of-the-box solutions. For example, like not adding custom game logic to an 1155, because blockchain is complicated, and as soon as you open that Pandora's box of, oh, we want to do this, we want to do that, it really exponentially increases your dev time, increases your, as you pointed out, your economics of your game. And so for some publishers that may work, and for some that may not, and that's why most just stick to the predefined standards. Please.
So a question that comes to mind is just like, essentially we are seeing a standard. A publisher, a group of publishers build these sites, build out a platform that's going to create its own, essentially in-house fiat system and conversion currency that can then be turned into Indian currencies. Or using both local currencies in each of the member group's products.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And so risk in general is, number one, about mitigation, as you said. In a blockchain ecosystem, there's very low risk because you can't charge back cryptocurrency. You just can't do that. Unless you're Ethereum Classic recently, but that's another story. The other concept of that is risk is always given to somebody. Right? And so as a game publisher, if you're not assuming that risk, it's important to understand that someone else may be. Right? And so from a publisher perspective, right, if we relied on Coinbase, right, a third-party company, to be that fiat on-ramp from dollars to tokens, sure. Exactly. And the issue surrounding that is, especially in the blockchain world, when you give something to somebody, you can't take it back. Right? So if you accept a $1,000 payment for cryptocurrency, right, you give them that $1,000 and the person charges it back. Not as easy to nix their $1,000 in cryptocurrency you gave them as it would be in a centralized system, so far as like Steam credits. So that's something that's still being figured out, and that's why I think giving it to a third party that assumes all that counterparty risk is where it's going to be. And then once we have these dollars blockchain ties, blockchain it, some verb like that, then we let them into the ecosystem. And it's important to note that fraud is almost never going to be zero, but we can definitely decrease fraud to 1 per 20 items instead of 1 to 7.5. Any other questions? Or please.
Maybe just a comment about presuming maybe fraud is inherently a thing, whereas in some of these games, maybe that's part of the fun. So, for example, you're probably familiar with EVE Online, where fraud plays a big role in the actual gaming environment. Maybe that's part of the risk of playing the game, and then could also be part of the risk of playing RuneScape or something like that. So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, fraud at every level is priced into product, everything from supermarkets to games to, Netflix, right? And so we as a society have priced that in, because at a certain point, as long as we make money, we don't care. But on another level, it is a goal to always reduce risk, and with that comes fraud. So I won't say, fraud doesn't have its place. It will always have its place, for better or worse. But we'll always do something to mitigate, whether it's increased prices or increased security.
Where essentially
it's also worth to note that coming to smart contracts also you can define if you buy this item, it has a cooldown time of 7 days before it can be traded, and the publisher can very easily take it back if the payment doesn't clear. So something to think about as well.
So with current standing assets, with blockchain assets, as the changes get better and we crypto and it's fair to say that we can go to the grocery store and buy bread
I mean, everything is a fungible value, right? Maybe if the cashier likes it enough to give you a price on it, right? I once had to trade my watch for food because I forgot my credit card. So, you know, back to the earliest days, there was no currency. Everything was medium of exchange, pretty much. Right? And so, you could see items becoming mediums of exchanges. I don't know. It's possible. Good to think about. What's up?
You just need an exchange.
Exactly.
You just need someone who's willing
To pair it.
to will work our store, and the grocery store says, hey, boom, you can cash this. You can Bitcoin this, you can whatever it is.
Exactly. I mean, we use fiat as a ubiquitous currency to which everything can be traded into, but that's not to say you can't just trade the item for the other item to begin with. The great thing about cash is everybody wants cash. Not everybody may want the diamond sword. So that's probably why you don't see that in grocery stores quite yet. Sweet. Good. Okay, I have a little more. Sorry about that, guys. So taking a look at the blockchains out there, I know there are like a million more, but I'm just going to, show 4 that I know off the top of my head. We got Bitcoin, Ethereum, Tron, and EOS. And really what you need to take away from this slide is the bottom-most row. None of them are game ready. And to talk about price per transaction. Transaction is everything from picking up an item in game, right, to trading it to your friend, to selling it onto exchange, anything that has to do with using the item at all with the blockchain is considered a transaction. And so you can see the issue if you open up a game and the game says, oh, you can't trade this item to Bobby because you need to pay a cent to trade it. Right? That's never going to happen. That's a complete blockchain killer. And until we can get the price per transaction to 0, that's never going to happen. And to speak a little on that, the reason transaction fees aren't 0 today, which is as easy as changing a constant or a formula, is that transaction fees incentivize decentralization. Right? Where if you're a miner, a third-party miner, you can recoup rewards by ensuring that transactions are valid and the blockchain is decentralized. The way we mitigated that in my company at Stardust is we say, if you want to use our blockchain SaaS, you got to run a node, right? Straight out of Ripple's playbook. If you want to use our interbank payment system, you got to run a node. And that's how we arbitrarily define that price per transaction to be 0, because we say, if you don't use our blockchain, it's moot. And if you want to use our blockchain, you got to run a node. And that's how we enforce that decentralization. The other part is the TPS, or transactions per second. And you can imagine, if you have 1 million games on the blockchain, or maybe not 1 million games, let's say 1,000 games with 1 million players, how many players are going to be picking up items every second? How many are going to be trading on exchange? How many are going to be trading within the game? Maybe more than 10 per second, maybe more than 2,000 per second, possibly even more than 4,000 per second. What is the ratio of transactions per second we need to sustain a workload of 1 million players? We're not quite sure yet. We do know that 4,000 is not enough during peak times. During CryptoKitties' peak at the height of 2017, it had about 15,000 players, and it was on the Ethereum blockchain, and the transactions got to about 400 per second, which obviously, if you think of transactions per second as a pipe, that's more water than the pipe can handle. And so it got into a bidding war with transaction fees, because the person who paid the most fee would get the transaction going first. And so people had to pay like $30 to trade a CryptoKitty. It was not a good time. And so that's why all of these blockchains really get failing grades so far as being quote unquote game ready. Oh, wow, I do have a lot more. So consensus mechanisms, proof of work, proof of stake. I know you guys are probably getting tired of hearing me, so I'll keep this brief. Proof of work is what we have now both in the Ethereum and Bitcoin blockchains, and it has to do with the computational power of your computer. Size matters. And the issue with this is it allows people to combine their computing powers in a way that it actually disincentivizes decentralization, because to get the block reward, if you have to solve a hard math problem, your computer can't solve it by itself, so you're going to team up with Sally and Joe and their computers to solve that math problem. People are going to keep teaming up until eventually it's all going to be one team running on one transaction, and instead of a bunch of decentralized computers all verifying the transactions, you're just going to have one group verifying transactions. That could be a malicious group. And so that's an issue that proof of work is trying to tackle, and by transitioning proof of work to proof of stake, which is instead of the size of your computer mattering, it's the size of the amount of the currency you hold. And that incentivizes people to, number one, accumulate currency, so they have a larger proportion of the block reward. Number two, it allows people to earn proportional amounts of block reward. Instead of with proof of work, you either earn it all or none. Right? Proof of stake, you can earn like 10% or 5%. So you don't have to team up with other people because you just don't need to get the block reward. Scaling options. This would increase, the TPS, transactions per second, to 10,000 plus to get us where we need to be. Plasma is considered a blockchain of blockchains, considered a tree, where if you have a game, you run your own independent blockchain, and every game runs a little blockchain, and then they all kind of group at the top. And it's almost like sharding, except not quite, so don't get confused with that diagram. But every little game is its own blockchain. The issue with this is obviously they need validators on every chain, so it's almost a non-starter, and that's why sharding has a lot more popularity, which is instead, if we're running one big blockchain right now, and I'm a miner on it, I have to verify every transaction. That's not good for the blockchain, because it means every miner who joins, the transaction time actually gets slower and slower because they need everybody to respond, whether that's a valid transaction or not. So more people join, more people need to respond. Now with sharding, predefined groups of nodes talk about predefined games, right? And so instead of 1 million people looking at games X, Y, and Z, you have 50 people each looking at games X, Y, and Z. And what that does is it allows the blockchain to be sharded, and so every game gets its own little shard, right? But from a security standpoint, it actually holds very well, because the concept of random sampling, any more than 30 is usually a good sample of the entire population. So this actually takes advantage of that. So far is, right now I can ask 30 of you random sampled, and it would be a good approximation, probably the whole state of Washington. If you guys lived here, of course, there may be some bias. But that aside, that's the advantage of sharding, and what it takes advantage of is random sampling to get faster throughput for transactions. I know there was a lot. Very sorry to have spoken so much and inundated you guys with info. Happy to answer any more questions, both up here or offline. Entrepreneurship, gaming, blockchain, anything you want. Yeah, that's a hard question. Why so difficult? I don't think so. I think proof of work has its time in the sun. I think one thing that proof of work does very, very well, better than proof of stake, is when size matters, you can't, of your computer, of course, you can't get an attack from, let's say, a botnet, right? With proof of stake, where the size of your computing power obviously does not matter, you can have a lot more hash power on the network from bad sources. Because at a certain point under 1 gigahertz processor, proof of work doesn't even matter, but for proof of stake it does. And so that's an issue with proof of stake. In the end, and keep in mind, I focus on this solely from a business perspective. I don't care as long as it works and it has everything I need to deliver a great solution to my customers. And so because of that, I don't really get ingrained in that argument, but I do think it is still ongoing. Anyone else? While I smile. Sorry? No, I must have not thought it was important enough. I have business cards though, so I'll hand them out after this.
Thank you, Cannon.
Thank you.
Amazing.